So is everybody able to see the presentations up? Good deal. All right. I just want to double check on that. I know, as usual, I got the short straw today. I'm going to be kind of leading through, open this up a little bit, and go through some of this content. And I know Alana and Gail will be jumping in. I know we've talked through different sections. We'll have some a little different insights for you as we go through this today. So we'll make sure we get that. So having said that, I'll go ahead and get us rolling today. I know each time we kind of have these same slides, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them, but I do want to remind everybody as we go through any of these objectives or any of this content that it's important to understand your own beliefs as you go into any of these pieces. Like, where is this coming from? Where's my understanding of this situation, I guess, originating? So it really all starts with those beliefs. So you repeat that each time just to remind us that. And, think about your own process for what education is like. So what am I doing fitting into the big picture here? Because that's something I was thinking about as I was getting ready for this, that we really have to, I don't think fight's the right word, but really acknowledge that special education is not an independent endeavor. This is a group effort and we're connected. It's in fact a supplementary or additive model where everyone's getting the same starting point, but some students get additional supports and coming through special education because of their eligibility. So as we go through that, we talk about these each time as we get into this process. We talked about the procedural pieces of the process. That was one of our first sessions, talking about just getting here as far as due dates and timelines and those kind of things. The substance is really where we still are. What's the substance of this process? What's supposed to be in here? What's the content supposed to look like? Those kind of things. Some big ideas with these that I don't want to leave off or ignore are really the concepts that, not only we're mainly focusing on the content of the IEP, but do keep in mind the process does have to be monitored. After the IEP is developed, progress monitoring has to take place, and making those responsive changes based on that information. So it's not just the substance, but because a well-written IEP is meaningless if we don't carry it out. So don't overlook the implementation piece of that, and make sure your systems are built to sustain that, what you design in the IEP. So we'll talk more about those pieces, I think, as we dive into the specific pages here. Get into that. So today we are in our final session 5 of the IEP best practices. And we're going to touch on these 4 areas. I know we'll go back and forth a little bit. It's still a lot of content to cover, as always. So we'll try to do it justice and answer questions as we go through. I know Alana just posted in the chat. If you have any questions there, I'll try to pause as we go through the sections. If you have any questions, or if you want to raise your hand or just let us know and unmute and ask away, and we'll be happy to address things as best we can. But the first area we're going to touch on is provisions, which is another word for the services that we're going to employ. And more or less, we're going to be following the same structure of what the IEP system currently looks like. And that is one of the conversations we had, just keeping in mind, this is what it looks like right now. We can't predict the future and what that future is going to look like, but for now, this is what we've got to work with. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the provisions pages, these are all the things that are generally listed on the provisions page itself. It's generally where we spend the most time is with defining the services, both special ed and related, talk about transportation and all those other pieces as well. So just kind of touching base on these pieces and kind of redirecting you to a few resources if you want to know a little bit more, like assistive technology and accessible materials. We're going to talk, Gail's going to talk a little bit about that accessible materials experience. So let's go ahead and go in the special education and related services. So I mentioned this early on when we talked a little bit about on the goals page, when we talked about specially designed instruction. Special and related services further define that piece. So this is, now we're talking about the best location and time and support, and I guess details around this particular event. So how much time is a student going to need every day or week or month to make progress? And what's the best place for this to happen? So those are really key pieces as we're looking at this. So where's the best place? And I guess we were talking about this morning too, and this has come up in a couple of conversations I've had around this very thing. But and we'll talk about placement later on. But we do need to at least consider the student being placed in a general education setting, even if they haven't been in the past. So even if that's not something that even after a couple of years or even longer, the student has not been a part of a general education setting, we still need to think about that in terms of services and placement and all those things in the IEP. So we can't necessarily, we're not going to ask anyone to start over from scratch every year, but each year we need to start this conversation and review it, at least annually, so we have a solid understanding of why we're placing the student where they are. And we have evidence to support those proposals. So we are not just making a judgment based on something other than the student's needs. So consider locations, consider time. It's worth talking about, and maybe this is something we can bring out to the whole group too, is a lot of times when we read through IEPs, and I think Alana and Gail can chime in on this too, we see pretty much consistently within a school almost exactly the same minutes in each IEP. So if you go into, and usually it aligns to the class schedule. So 45-minute schedule, somehow everyone has ELA for 45 minutes or math or whatever it happens to be. And sometimes that's really what's going to happen. But I'd also consider that sometimes that causes us to I guess not pad our numbers really, but put more minutes than we actually spending with that student. So just be thoughtful about that. Is 45 minutes actually the amount of time that we're providing services for this individual student, or the time that they actually require, or is it possibly less than that? So we just have to think about that. As I know some of the examples we've used, sometimes the instruction, the special design instruction, might just happen right at the beginning of class for 10 minutes in that class period. And if that's the case, then let's record it that way. We're not there the whole time, or at the end, or whatever it happens to be. So that's just thinking through how we're serving and how we're actually spending the time with our students. Gail, do you want to go ahead and?
Yeah, and I was going to say in the narrative box, in that text box for your provisions, be very clear about what is going to happen. Do the stranger test, because I know a lot of times when I look at IEPs, it'll say support. Well, I know that if you write that, you know what support looks like. But if you send that to another district, they won't know what your support looks like. They know what their support looks like. So try to be really intentional and careful with the way you word what you write in that narrative. And even if it takes a while, write exactly what is going to happen, and try not to use those words that are generic. So kind of do that stranger test. Think of the one move-in conference you had where you didn't really know what they were doing because they used all those kinds of generic words. So try to be specific when you write in those text boxes.
Yeah, don't be that guy that writes the, but I think that's a really good point. I always think about I always ask folks to go a little further with that stranger test even, keep in mind there's people in the room that don't understand what you're talking about. So if sometimes parents aren't going to have the question, I guess the comfort level to raise the questions, or if, as you get older, students get older and they're more involved in the process, do they understand what you're talking about? What's going to happen in these 15 minutes or 20 minutes or for 7 hours a day? I've seen people put that as a service for 6.5 hours a day. The student's going to be in this. Well, what's going to happen specially in that situation? How do we describe that? Now, we don't have enough room in there to record a whole curriculum by any means, but we can describe what kinds of things are going to happen for the students. So we don't, again, this goes back to, I think we talked about this in goals earlier, but the IEP is not the curriculum for the student. It's describing what else we get beyond the curriculum, what extra work. So that's really what we're defining here.
And to Matt's point about parents, if you are more specific and you stay away from those words like support, because a parent can come back later and say they're not supporting my child the way they said they were going to, or the way I thought they were going to. And so then you're kind of stuck because you have to explain more. So just to be upfront and more transparent, if you describe it at those conferences and write exactly what you're going to do, then there can't be any then it's clear, or should be clearer to a parent that this is what is happening, and then is it or is it not is another question. But again, just try to stay away from those generic words.
And I don't know, it's just as clear as you can be within reason within those processes. You don't want to nail yourself down to here's exactly what we're going to do every minute of the day, but give yourself, here's the types of things that have shown will work for the student. So here's the types of things we're going to try to do in that situation. Here's some maybe a family of strategies or interventions that we know will be more likely to be effective. We're going to talk about that. Those are the kinds of things we put in there. So just be careful about, as with anything in an IEP, about being too comfortable with cutting and pasting things, just repeating things from year to year. And look again, even though this service was in place last year, is it still valid for the student? Other things we need to update and change. So that's, and special education services also include our speech language pathologists as well. So those two things are covered under that umbrella. Related services are practically everything else. Usually related service providers include things like occupational, physical therapy, mental health professionals, those kind of things, psychologists, nursing, those are all in that list. And when you go, and most IEP systems are going to give you a list of the options that you have there. So be careful with that kind of thing. For those of you that are new to this, that we talk to those people first. Before we put in an occupational therapy service, there needs to be an evaluation regarding those. Even assistive technology, those kind of pieces, if we're going to add those areas of, or if we suspect those needs exist, we need to verify that first before we start adding, because that can create a problem if you indicate on an IEP that the student received a service and don't tell the service provider that that's going to happen. So I won't say that I've experienced that, but I have experienced that. So so that's just something to keep in mind. So there's a lot that could be said about this. It's important. This is really where your numbers come from as far as what the systems calculate for your least restrictive environment. It takes into account the full length of the school day, then based on what you enter in here as far as how many days, how many minutes, it calculates those final percentages for you and gives you a recommendation for what the least restrictive environment can be, or the coding should be within the state systems. So question, before I move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about transportation next. Any comments, questions from our team? Or
Matt, I want to go back to something you had said previously. You were talking about, like, so if I have an applied or an English lab class in the high school and class periods are 50 minutes, and if we're only working on the goal of the English goal for 15 minutes of that, you are suggesting we put 15 minutes, even though it's considered a special education class, so only 15 minutes of that would be calculated into the LRE?
It could be. I think that'd be it's something to at least discuss within there. I'm not going to say that it's one of those. It kind of depends in the situation. If it is an adapted class fully, and it is a special education environment that the students engaged in, then it might be the whole class period. But
Okay,
if it's a
that
situation,
clarifies in my head what I heard you say, and thank you. I apologize for interrupting.
no, you're absolutely fine. That's a great point. That's kind of what I was thinking as I was saying it too, because there's whole lots of different ways you can do it. But I'm just thinking in terms of if they're in a general education setting and you come in and work with a group for 15 minutes, we want to think about those 15 minutes as being that service time. But if they're giving direct, if their adapted instruction is going on throughout the class period in there, then that might be something might be count. I don't know. We can get into that. That might be a whole session just talking about the different ways we can count time in minutes. I just think we want to be thoughtful about it, have good conversations.
Yeah, it just expanded my thinking a little bit, which is good. Thanks.
I don't know if I always try to do that. Maybe that's a dangerous thing, but I appreciate that. So, let's go slide into transportation here. Talk a little bit about this. So most of the time, if not all the time, I think the system might be built this way now, that this is connected to a related service for transportation also. So special education transportation is connected to a related service of transportation. So essentially, if the student's going to be on a different bus and need specific services or supports on that bus, this will include transportation, could be medical, those kind of things. Any selection you make there, you're going to have you'll justify that there. So there's an explanation of what's going to happen within that piece. So one of the things, and this is maybe bouncing outside of the realm of this conversation, but if there's any reason that if the IEP says the student must receive special transportation and the student is removed from that for some reason, that is the big R removal as far as removal from services. So unless we can provide another means for that student to get to school, and sometimes that will include making an agreement with a parent that they get them and we reimburse them for mileage, those kind of things. It gets a little tricky there in those situations. So just be really thoughtful about that. If there's some reason that the special transportation is not working or the students not to, we promise this is going to happen. It's part of their free and appropriate public education since we put it on the IEP. So we just have to make sure it happens in some way, shape, or form. So I know that's maybe a little heavier point on this one than you might have expected, but it sometimes can get folks in a little bit of a hard spot just because of that piece. Any additions or comments on transportation? I almost said transition, and that would have been a whole different thing. Any questions? That one's pretty straightforward, I think. Good. Slide on to the next. I guess slide to the next slide. For accessible materials, I was going to go ahead and turn this one over to Gail. And we talked about this a little bit this morning, and she had some really good points. So I want to make sure she gets a chance to share that.
All right. So accessible materials, every district should have a digital rights manager that is in charge of it, actually. Often we think of the accessible materials as something, the NIMAS forms to be filled out or for those students that are blind or low vision. Those students are automatically qualified to have accessible materials. However, kids that are SLD and have a severe print disability also could qualify. Now, I know there are questions and you would need the help of a site to help you answer the questions. But I think it's a resource that we often overlook because it's more, we don't often have kids that are blind and low vision. There aren't very many of them, but we do have a lot of kids that have a print disability. So this is just something that you fill it out. Then if they qualify, they can have access to materials auditorily, and your digital rights manager can set them up with an account, show you how to use it, how to access it. Currently, Patents holds NIMUS, and the helps the digital rights managers. But it is well worth trying to answer those questions for some students that really struggle. That could, if they had this accessible material, could access the general ed curriculum that they can't access now. So take a look at it. Again, I was the principal at the School for the Blind, so my kids automatically qualified, so I just had to push the button. But there are several questions to answer about the extent of the disability. Does anybody have any questions? And you should be able to find out who your digital rights manager is for your district, or if you're in a co-op, somebody should have that job. Does anybody have any questions?
And Matt put in the patents for in the chat. If you guys want to have any more information about that, Matt added that to the chat for you guys for a resource.
Yeah, and if you, I do believe at least there used to be a link, is that right, Matt? A link to the NIMUS forms in the IEP, so you can, if you click yes to accessible materials, it should open up and you can see the questions. And again, some of them, I would say you might need the help of your resident psychologist to help you answer the questions, but it is definitely well worth your time. And it's like anything else, once you see the questions, it's easy to think about kids that you might have that it might help.
Yeah. And so Patents Project is your contact for that. The Indiana Center for Accessible Materials, ICAM, is a link on their site. You can go in and find all kinds of information about all those pieces that Gail just mentioned. So lots of good resources there. They're a great one. If you haven't bookmarked them somewhere, I would suggest doing that. They are a great resource for you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Gail.
And Patents can give you more information about NIMUS and the forms and how to fill them out and how to access the digital rights, and they also can probably tell you who the digital rights manager is for your district. Right. So and I would
essentially, this gives you access to audio or different texts and different media for free if you qualify. Right. So just
it's free, and it's a national database. So if you have a textbook or something and you think, oh, we don't have it, that NIMUS will have it. So, yeah.
It's a great resource. And I'll make sure that link and everything gets into our Padlet. So when you go, you can check that out. And we can share the Padlet link toward the end of today also. But that is also in those self-paced modules if you're going that route.
And it's really for high school kids or even middle school kids, once they understand it, it's really easy for them to access it and get the information and become independent on getting the information that they need. So it's user friendly for kids.
And PENS is going to be let's see, if our school will provide, can we put it in there and not fill out the form? If you do have it, I mean, you may be able to, just mention that in the text that the school will provide this, but just keep in mind if you are in fact providing it, or if you put it in the IEP, then that is something the school is, it has, I guess, I don't know about contracted necessarily, but they promised are going to provide. So it's important to carry to fulfill with that. So yeah, the school may be able to provide that. And really these days it's a lot more, most of the content is digital, so that's a lot more accessible to more people. So that's a great thing, but not everything is. And so, a lot of those novels and different text, not all textbooks will be in there, but a lot of those novels we have for our elective classes and things are not available, I guess, through that. But there's things like Audible and pieces like that do have some stuff. So
Yeah,
there's a lot
NIDIS
there.
has there is a huge repository of information.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about assistive technology. That's also within, I guess, Patent's umbrella. They have actually a library of assistive technology devices and systems, software, all kinds of things that you can go on and check out. So you can, it's like just like in a book library, you can go in and tell them what you're looking for. They'll suggest a few things, and you can sign them out and try them. We used to do this all the time, just to try some different communication devices, try some different switches and things like that with students to find out what works with them before we invested. That's a great question. So if you haven't, they're a great resource. They also have, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to have a kind of a reclaimed technology or computer piece where they basically repurpose computers from different school districts and I'll give them away for free. You can sign up for them. We used to do that all the time, especially when technology is hard to come by.
Well, and the other good thing about patents is this assistive technology is especially when you have kids where you're just trying stuff, or like parents would say, oh, I want my kid to have a talking calculator. Well, no, because they're not even doing math yet. Or we all know that technology changes so much. This is a way to use something, try something to see what really works, because we all know sometimes the adults don't get it right and kids don't like it, don't want to use it, or they grow out of it and need they need more switches, or they need something different. And so until you get a kid in high school when they're going to graduate and they really know what kind of technology works, would you want to buy something that they are going to use later? So this really helps with the money side of things, to try things that, hey, let's see if it works.
And I think I want to make sure I mention here too that assistive technology is not all electronic technology. It can be physical things like communication boards or PEC systems and things like that are all things that are not technology, not electronic at all. A pencil grip can be assistive technology for a student. Those kind of things, or special kind of seating can be that as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's software or computer-based or electronic, but really any kind of product item that we've adjusted or put in place so the student can access the work is key. But you can also think of assistive technology of things like co-writer, word prediction software, and things like that are also that, or speech text devices are all that as well. So it's covers both ends, and there's a whole lot of room in between those two extremes. Now, a lot of times, and you might want to check, I guess I say this, check your local listings on this one, but if you're going to assign assistive technology, a lot of times occupational therapists or physical therapists will also evaluate students for assistive technology. So that's something that
and SLPs too. SLPs use it a lot.
So if you suspect that, or you want to have a conversation before you prescribe something, check it out. Make sure you've done your homework and bring those people in, because technically that's another could be a reevaluation component for students to find out what works for them. So we don't just want to randomly select things in here because there's a process. So we're going to be careful with that as we're going forward. So that's kind of a common theme, I guess, on this page. So assistive technology is a little toggle switch, yes or no in the system. So if you choose no, it'll say there's no need. If you choose yes, it'll make you explain what the need is, describe it, so it's clear. what's going on. And in this case, at this section, even on this whole page, is a space where we wanted to start describing the tool. I know when I talk with patents to bring them up, one of the things that they encourage people to do is if you know a device works, in that this is the one. This is, the student must have this in order to access. Their advice a lot of times is to go ahead and call it out, name it. Here's the only thing we know that works. I'm always reluctant to do that because I usually, in most cases, there's a multitude of ways to meet a student's needs. So we want to be careful. You know, we don't want to just say we need an iPad here, or we need a co-writer program. We can describe, hey, we just need a tablet with apps available that can do this. Or we need a program that can predict words for the student to use, so that you're not tying someone else down to something they just don't have. So that's just something to think about. And really that's something going back to that narrative that we talked about with the special education services. We're not trying to tell other people how, we're telling them kind of what needs to be done. Here, we're not giving you that, here's exactly the prescribed services that need to take place, as far as here's exactly minute to minute what's going to happen. It's more of a, here's the ideas that need to take place, and here's some general concepts that need to be in place. So assistive technology leads us, this can be a really fun conversation for folks. I mean, there's the extended school year. It's something you want to just make sure now, it's relatively new in our process, but make sure you document your conversations around the need for extended school year, because every time it comes up, you need to talk about it and make sure that information is updated at least annually, like most everything we talk about. So extended school year is special education that extends beyond the typical school year. Obviously, it's not the same as summer school. This is unique to the student. And we have to determine as a team whether these services are necessary. So this, if you choose that this is necessary, you'll have special ed and related services that only apply for the extended school year. So that's, if you make that selection, we don't do that here. Yeah, that's a scary thing when you hear that, as I've been in some FIEPs where I've heard that phrase, and you just kind of take a deep breath and work your way out of it, I guess. But so there's really not a single standard. I know that districts do something. But what I would tell you is, as a district, you need to be consistent about this. What do we look for? If regression or recoupment is a concern, then we need to make sure we document that, or we earlier about this. Your progress monitoring is key to this discussion. If you want to talk about regression, and you even suggest someone at the table suggests extended school year is necessary for this student, if that's one of your criteria you're going to look at, do you even have the data to support that one way or the other? So look at your progress monitoring information and see, after a long break, say we're out of school for a week or 2 weeks for a long winter break or spring break or something like that, can you see if the student's ability has, or not ability, but knowledge has regressed, or it takes a long time for us to recoup that lost knowledge? Even if it's a little bit, now we set ourselves back weeks because we're trying to catch up with those pieces. And I guess one thing to mention here is extended school year is not just summer. It's not just in the summer. It could be over any break. It could be a longer school day for a student if that's necessary. So extended school year is just beyond the norm for students. So it's typically, folks think of it as in the summer, but it's really doesn't have to be. If you notice that a student has regression over a week and you see that evidence, then there may be a need for us to put something in play. Now, that's just something to talk about. So any questions around that one? That can be a little touchy subject sometimes, but it is, we definitely want to make sure we have some conversation around that.
I I do have a question about this.
Sure.
We do something that I've never quite been certain that we're doing it correctly. So we have related service counselors, that see our students throughout the year, and so we put that in as related service. But then, we put in, one of our related service counselors does what we write in as ESY services over the summer, 4 hours over the summer. Is that really ESY though?
So, well, I don't know. I guess technically it would be. I think that it is different than the typical school year would be, but I also have a little bit of a, I guess the conversation I would want to have around those kind of things is how, not every student's going to need extended school year. How do we decide that this happens for students, or is it something we do for everybody?
No, and we don't put it in for everyone.
Okay.
We only put it in if the related service counselor feels that, so it's typically, it's offered to 8th grade students that are transitioning to the high school. And he'll do it for up to 4 hours over the summer. Could be
Okay.
4 1-hour sessions, could be 2 2-hour sessions, whatever. He'll bring them over to the high school, let them tour, use their locker, that kind of thing. So it's typically just for our 8th grade
That
students.
transition to new building.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think
Is it voluntary, or do you do it based on, is it voluntary?
So usually at the transition conference, he will present it to the parent if he feels like the student would benefit from it. And then it's really up to the parent, sometime over the summer, he makes contact with the parent and it's up to the parent to follow through. But I'm told to put it in as ESY services, 4 hours between, June 1st to August 1st. I just don't know that I would have put that in as ESY.
So Alana had a good point that she didn't want to share out loud at first.
Oh, I was gonna tell you, yeah, I just said, could that be part of the transition plan, more in the transition plan or the activities? If that's what it sounds like it's supporting, it doesn't like unless the data for the counseling, it doesn't sound like ESY to me, but I mean, you can have a conversation about that, but it does sound like it would make more sense to me in the transition. I don't know what you think, Matt.
Yeah, I think when you look here too, I mean, the services are, specific unique needs based on IEP goals, just like almost every service we describe. And it fits more easily in that transition services in my head. However, I don't know that it's necessarily wrong to put it here. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that. It's more, I would have put it here, but I get, as long as it's documented and it's clear what's supposed to happen, I think that's okay. Like I said, there's not really any clear standard for what qualifies for ESY. So I guess what I would say is that one of the things you mentioned is a little bit of a red flag for me is when someone thinks this is appropriate, is when we select it. And I would make sure that we have some guidance for when we know it's appropriate. What's the indicator for me that this is appropriate for the student? And that's just a conversation to have, and that's well documented, because I don't know. I don't think it's that kind of a big deal, but I always get a little bit hesitant when there's a decision's made about things like that outside of a case conference. It's just, here's what we're going to do. So we want to make sure that conversation is part of the case conference.
Yeah, and it is, the conversation is part of that case conference. So it is, I just, it's interesting, the mention of in the transition services. So
yeah, that's where I would put it, I think.
Yeah, that's what I think about when we've had that conversation with kids moving from junior high to high school, all the time, or it really can happen. Any buildings change, truly. Just if we know students, especially, like I was thinking of a couple of kiddos I used to work with autism, that we just need to set their expectations up. Here's what the building looks like. Here's where this is. Here's where we go for these things. So they get an opportunity when there's no distractions to go through that routine.
No,
Right.
and yeah, it's
I
a
think
good
it's a great
idea. I mean,
thing.
I know
Yeah.
at my son's high school, I mean, 8th grade, everybody went. Like all the 8th graders went to North Central.
And
So
we do that as well, Gail. We do that as well. This is just completely
Separate.
so it's
separate.
individualized. But if a student needed that individual help to transition, that absolutely. I mean, it like I'm with Matt. Like I might put it in transition, but I don't think it I mean, if you put it in it ESY,
Yeah.
at
Not
least
right or wrong.
it's
Okay. That's
documented. It's
I
and
don't
yeah, and
think you're
I
breaking
just
any
make sure
rules
in
by
the
doing
notes.
that. I think it's just
Right, just make sure in the notes that it's clear why you're doing it
Yeah.
and how much
And
time
I
you're going to
think it's
spend.
what I like about this too is sometimes those kind of conversations get buried in the conference notes.
Yeah.
And just making sure it's out there as far whether it's a transition or extended school year service, it's there. It's in the body of the IEP where everyone can see it, and you don't have to look special for it. It's right in front of you, so it's a clear thing.
Okay.
So I appreciate that.
Thank you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. I always appreciate those. Make us work for our
Make us
dinner
think.
here. That's right. So aids and supports. This one can be a little different depending on how you look at it. So this one has a couple different pieces. There's a couple yes, no questions involved in this that, based on the services and needs, is there any training or knowledge necessary? So things I think about with this one, and you can chime in with different ideas of this. I think about, one of the big ones is behavior plans. If the student has a behavior plan, they're going to be in a classroom, then that teacher needs to know what their role is, because their part of their job is to help you, and not, I won't say enforce, but carry out that behavior plan for the student. Same on a lesser, go ahead, Gail.
Well, what I was just going to add with the behavior plan piece is if there is thinking outside the box, not just teachers and paras, but does the lunch lady know how to how to respond or not respond to a kid with autism that won't look at them when they talk to them? Or does the secretary or the SRO or those other people that might come into contact with that student, they might need some training or at least some specific information about how to interact with a student. So yes, we always go to thinking about the paras and the teachers, but you also need to think about those other people.
That was a really good point. And I always think in terms of like de-escalation, and
Bus drivers.
Yeah, if you raise your voice, that's not going to de-escalate the student. In fact, it's going to make it even more intense. So what else should we do? So we all know what's going on. I also think of this in terms of things like accommodations. Does everybody know what this accommodation is supposed to look like, when it's appropriate, when it's gonna happen, that kind of thing. So I know this also has sensory needs involved there, special design instruction, talking about how we might talk about how we're planning to work together to develop some adapted content here, so that can be part of that as well. We also, the second piece of this is, I guess before we move on to that, is there anything we add to that? What other things that might fall into that category that we'd have to touch on?
I'll just say that if for student success, because any kid, the smallest kid, will figure out your weakest link and will do something that adult doesn't know. So it's really important to make sure that, like an accommodation, so a student can say, well, yes, I get this. And in fact, they do not, or they need something, or there's a behavior plan in place. So just to try to touch all the bases. And training, it's not that they have to go somewhere and do something. It can be as simple as you talking to them and explaining. So that's it.
Yeah. Well, I would just run through my head other things too. To a certain extent, if we have any medical concerns or those kind of things, we want to make sure everybody's knows what's going on. Not to say that we're going to hey, you need to administer this protocol or do something like that, but know what the warning signs are. I was just thinking about a student with epilepsy, for example. Does everyone know how to recognize those kind of things and what to do? With the students going into a seizure, that kind of thing. Those kind of things are key, because we certainly don't want someone to be caught flat-footed and not know what to do. Because a lot of times, we don't want to get folks into that panic situation. We want to try to prepare them for that possibility, I suppose. Because I remember the first time that I was around that situation, and then the last time, how much different that was when I knew what I was supposed to do. It's a whole different thing. And modifications needed for the student to participate in school or classroom activities. So this is, at least the way this is worded here, is specific to activities. So thinking through, for the student to be included in what's going on in that building, in the classroom, around the building, are there things that need to be done so they can be a student just like everybody else? So we just want to make sure that we have that conversation. Sometimes it can be, I always bring up the point of like physical modifications. A student who is in a wheelchair, they're going to need some physical supports to, a different kind of desk or a location in the classroom that's specific to them, so they can get in and out of that room as independently as possible. Same kind of things when we have different convocations, meetings, whole school events, as a student included. One of the things that I ran across, even this comes a bit later, about talking about extracurricular activities as well. Any student can be involved in the football program, but you have a student who's deaf, who wants to play, but what are we going to do to make sure they can? That happened. We had to figure that out, and it was pretty neat. But so aids and supports is just talking about, as the students go around the school day, are the staff members, the teachers, the adults in the building aware of what they need to be aware of? And have we set up the environments for the students so they can be a part of it? So they're part of the activities and not excluded just because of their disability. So we're going to do the best we can to include everybody as much as we possibly can. So, oh boy, this can start off a whole conversation. Sounds like a simple thing. The progress report timeline. And typically, well, the big idea is here, we want to make sure there's a plan to share with parents the progress students are making. So we have so they're not surprised when we go at a meeting, they have an opportunity to see the information as we do. So usually this follows the same timeline as report cards. I always warn people, we used to have, well, they don't necessarily do this everywhere, but had midterm reports also. And those were technically report cards that would go home. So if you have stuff like that, don't just simply say report card, just say quarterly, or go home quarterly, or whatever that schedule happens to be. But it's really up to you guys as a case conference committee to determine timelines. So have that conversation there. I would say, and this is kind of an aside, something that Gail brought up. Maybe I should let Gail go ahead and say, I don't want to speak for you, Gail, but go ahead.
What did I bring up? That you have to do the progress monitoring?
Yeah, the thing that I think that you reminded me of on this one is the difference between data collection and progress reporting. Is
yes.
A lot of times, we truly need to do more frequent data collection and progress monitoring than we do reporting. We only have to report it technically once a quarter if that's what the IEP says. One of the things that I would think would be frustrating as a parent is to receive a progress report that has nothing.
Or a line. It has a straight line that doesn't tell you whether you're
there's
progressing or not.
And so just be thoughtful about that as you're going to plan, as you're developing goals, as you're thinking about progress monitoring. Like I always say, teachers are the only folks who know what your day looks like really and what's realistic. So whatever's realistic, record that as your frequency of collection on your goals.
Well, I say that when this goes back to goals, but think about how many kids you have, how many goals do students really need? You're going to teach them things, even if you don't have a goal for that. I mean, if the most problematic thing is decoding, that doesn't mean that you're not going to do comprehension. You're just going to focus on decoding as a skill. Use things that you have. Use that end of the math chapter questions to get it. I know people have a lot of students. Some people have a big caseload. Figure out how to divide it up and put something in all the time so you can start to see those trend lines. But then that just gives parents more information. But if you wait until that report card time, it's going to be a nightmare.
Right. Well, plan for progress monitoring.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. Plan for it.
You have to have
the IEP in the first place.
4 data points to show a trend line according to our
Most
statistics
research,
person at the School for the Blind. You have to have 4 data points to start showing a trend line.
Yeah, the way that the IEP system works right now, you have to have 3. You have 3 points in, you get a little dud line that'll show you the trend of those 3 points. So that's maybe statistically one short, but that's the way the system works for.
I know, but
but I would just say that just be thoughtful about what you're reporting. I always recommend having conversations with parents, especially if it's new to them. If they don't know how to interpret this information, then take the time to make sure they understand it. Because the more informed they are, that makes them a more informed part of that case conference meeting later on too. So it's, give them some what you can. So progress reporting, make sure you document it, make sure you do it, and make sure you have some good information on there for parents to relate to. So the last thing on this page, barring any questions anyway, is the rationale. Let's see, there we go. Rationale. So there's a few boxes called this throughout the system. It's one thing that's necessary to qualify as a prior written notice. So if you ever read that phrase in any legal piece, what that essentially means is before we do something, we have to let parents know about it. That's when the IEP can serve as that, provided we include the rationale also. So prior written notice for an event is just the document saying, here's all the things we're going to do before we do them. That's all that means, at least to me. I'm sure we can have lawyers come in and chime in more exact language, but that's at least the thought there. So this is really just a place for you to capture your conversation. You've made your decisions, you've put in your services, you've put in your plan, your assistive technology, your educational materials and those kind of things. Here's where we get to talking about, well, where did our conversation go a little bit here? As far as services go, did we talk about a general education setting versus the special ed setting? How do we land on one or the other? Or even we talked about the number of minutes, how do we come to that agreement? Because we proposed that we needed 45 minutes a day, and it was decided we went to like 25. How do we get there? So a little bit of conversation around that. Doesn't have to be everything, but it's a place to document that involvement again of everybody on the team. So rationale is important. Sometimes you just have to be careful again of the cut and paste routine on this. Sometimes you want to just leave it. We discussed other options and ultimately decided on the ones written in the IEP. Yeah, that's true, but that's not exactly the conversation that took place. So a little more authentic piece. So the next piece of this, we get into, well, before I jump into LRE and placement decisions, any questions or concerns around the provisions section that we just kind of went through? Most of the time, just make sure you read the question as you're going through the process. Just take the time. Don't take for granted that the previous person did. Make sure you read the question and thoughtfully respond. And that's going to be better than most responses. I don't want to say that. Better than many responses. So thoughtful, read through the question and respond. So the next section we're going to talk about is the least restrictive environment and placement decisions. And we're going to talk about these questions as we go through. Least restrictive environment, where does this conversation begin? Where does this even start having this? And what about a continuum of services? You guys have heard that phrase. It's in our state guidance, well, not even guidance, right? Article 7 specifically addresses continuous services. Potential harmful effects, we'll talk about that. Placement decisions, what does that include and what should we consider when making those? And just keep in mind, books have been written about each one of these questions. So we're going to be touching the surface on these kind of things. So if you have questions, we'll do our best to answer, but there's all kinds of resources we can get you pointed to if you have deeper questions here. So this is big. Where does this conversation come from for least restrictive environment? It's based on decisions we've made throughout the conference, really. So and that's one reason it's placed in the order it is that we've talked about goals, we've talked about transition, we've talked about services. Now we talked about, based on all those things, what is the least restrictive environment for those things to happen? So that's really what we're coming to. So it's looking at all those things together against the length of the regular school day. So we're coming up with the code, the 50 or 51 or 52, that's based on the amount of time, the length of the entire school day and the amount of time the students spending in the special education environment. So one of the things I don't want folks to get caught up in is the labels that we put on those different categories, like resource room is one of the categories in the list of LRE codes. So that doesn't mean just because a student's in a resource room for any part of a day that's the code you have to use. So if they're in there just for a few minutes and doesn't match up, that I think it's 80% or more of this, or 20% of the school day or more in less in special education, something along those lines, then just going to be thoughtful about that. Just pay attention to the actual numbers. Don't worry about the label so much for those pieces. That might be helpful. But sometimes I see, oh, he's in the resource room, so you pick that category and it's really not accurate for you. So this is based on data in our discussion. So that's a big piece we always try to refer back to. So we talked about this, and I mentioned this, and this is one place I get pretty, some good conversations around. Every student has a right to a free and appropriate public education in the general education setting along with his or her peers. So that's where we start the conversation. So like I mentioned earlier, even if previously the student's been placed outside the general education setting, our conversation still needs to start here each time. So, okay, how can is there a way to, and that kind of piece. We have to justify any removal. That's the big piece to keep in mind with that conversation around placement, is there's no place where we have to justify the students' inclusion with their peers. We have to justify the exclusion from that class. We have to justify the removal from their peers. And so if there is any way, however difficult for us to provide these services, including supplementary aid services, accommodations, modifications in the Gen Ed classroom, then we at least need to entertain that conversation. And that's the best place for the student to learn, is right in front of with the primary instruction with their peers. So that's the things we have to consider with that process. Anything anyone wants to add to that piece? I know I got kind of hogged the mic on that one a little bit, but any questions or concerns about that piece? The other piece that comes to mind here is just keeping in mind, we haven't really talked about things like agendas for a meeting for a while, but that one of the reasons that placement decisions comes later is so that we have a chance to talk about the information, the data, the services, the goals first. because that's going to help us decide, well, where's the best location for the student to receive all that work or all those services. So, and the first quick answer is in the general education environment with their peers, but we have to justify if that's not going to work or it's not actually effective for that student. Yeah, Gail,
Well,
go ahead.
the only thing I would add is that just to keep in mind that it doesn't have to be the special ed teacher giving the service. So it doesn't have to be, well, it can't be because the special ed teacher isn't in there. A gen ed teacher might be the best person to provide the services. So it doesn't have to be the special ed teacher. And I know sometimes people get stuck on that when they're thinking about placement.
And that goes, we can get into a deeper discussion around special design instruction with that piece too. That's really what you're talking about, for the student to receive content that's adapted to meet their needs. The gen ed teacher can do that, but it's also with consultation and collaboration of the special ed teacher that typically would happen. Because if everybody gets it, it's not specially designed instruction. I think that's a simple way to look at that, I guess. So placement decisions, those are the big ideas of where we're starting and the conversations we need to have moving forward with that. Least restrictive environment, here's I guess, a version of the continuum there. So this is right out of Article 7, what you're seeing in front of you right here. General education, and I would say that the most I wouldn't say common error, but one of the errors that gives us the most trouble and causes the most concern is when we leapfrog from one area to the other. So if a student's in their level B, they're in that resource room setting outside in the and then all of a sudden, without discussion, they're homebound or something along those lines. So whenever you're moving from placement to placement, keep in mind it's not a common thing, but it does happen. You do need to talk about those other pieces along the way. So did you consider a separate classroom, or even a residential facility is less restrictive than the homebound instruction? Think about that. People don't always think about that as the case. So just be thoughtful with these pieces. So this continuum exists so that we are looking at the student moving from level to level rather than just jumping around within that. We can justify that. So this is right out of Article 7. This is pretty much the same thing with a little different language within their more simplified language. And really these go from the least restrictive situation, which the student has very little contact with special education, to the student is solely, like with a homebound or hospital placement, the student is on their own. They are it. So there's no chance for interaction with peers. At least with the other options, there's a slight chance, at least. So that's really continuing with services. Now, one thing I need to say here is we need to think about these pieces. That doesn't mean that we have an empty room sitting around waiting for students to be in a self-contained environment. If we don't have students that meets a need for them, then we're not going to hire a teacher and staff a room that's empty. So, but we do have to have a thoughtful plan. Hey, what happens if into our small school a person comes in that needs this kind of support? How are we going to manage those kind of things? So it's important that you've talked that through and have that documentation. That's really where your policy and procedure guides are important, but have that documented that this is what's our plan is if this happens. Because, and that, I don't want to pick on any school system really, but that is smaller school districts or a charter school system, when you have students with significant needs and you aren't, that's just not something you've encountered before, that can be a difficult situation. So it's just something as a thought problem to think through it. What we have to do, and once we're aware that we need to, what's the first steps to we're ready to get rolling with that?
Well,
idea
and
here. So,
like homebound, if you put a kid there, you have to have some sort of plan to think about how are you getting them back.
mhm.
Like you can't just say, okay, you're going to be homebound and goodbye and oh,
Right, right. Well, and there's a certain, and I don't want to get back into timelines too much, but there's a certain amount, we have to review that placement frequently. And if we place some student in those situations, we have to have a documented plan for a return.
right.
And there's all kinds of different little criteria there that we need to make sure we are aware of. So that's a really good point. So least restrictive environment, it's a big deal. It's just make sure you use your notes frequently, document your discussion, make sure it's clear why we chose this, and have your reasoning handy for that situation. So I guess before we leave off the least restrictive environment, the one thing that I mentioned in the question was potential harmful effects. So that's something that's in that, and it used to be, man, we have all kinds of difficult conversations around that little text box as it, having discussed potential harmful effects of the placement, those kind of things. And I would say it like this, is that, we don't have to have a special time of our case conference where we light candles and talk about, hey, this is the moment we're going to talk about potential harmful effects. You've already talked about those things already as you described the services, as you talked about the placement. So potential harmful effects just really means that anything that removes them from their non-disabled peers is a potential harmful effect, just because that's one way I guess the rule considers harmful is any removal from their peers is considered a harmful effect, at least potentially. So typically this is not talking about physical harm. Just know that's not what we're talking about. That's the harmful effect, is removal from their peers or receiving something that's different from what the peers receive. So, a lot of times if a placement is obvious, then the students might have to deal, or we're going to have to work with them on how to deal with. Folks are going to realize that the student's receiving something different, that they're different for some reason or another, and we have to acknowledge that to some extent. But the good news is we also have space to talk about why this is still the best placement for the student too, despite those potential harmful effects, and they are potential. We're going to place the student here because we can get to explain that too. And I would say this last thing too, is that there are potential harmful effects each time. And keep the word potential in mind and think about that definition: removal from their peers or receiving different instruction or notice than their peers are potential harmful effects. So I've read through IEPs that have said, well, there are no potential harmful effects. This is the perfect placement and environment for the student for them to be successful. And that may be true, but it's not the same thing everyone else is experiencing. So there's potential there. Now, not everyone sees it that way, but that's really the things to consider when you're documenting that potential harmful effect. So I don't know. I was asked by several districts years ago to go and talk specifically about that for like a half day. So I've got a few things in my quiver about that issue. So when we're creating a final IEP, that's the last section here. We can talk about a few things related to that event. So considerations of reevaluation, we want to make sure we talk about this every single time. At least annually as we're going through the events there. We have to do this legally at least once every 3 years. Every third year we have to just consider reevaluation, but our system's built that we're going to talk about it at least annually. So that's the way we're not going to miss that timeline. When you're looking at reevaluation, you have some considerations to make, whether it's going to be, you have the annual review, which is more or less reevaluating whether the student is still eligible for services. So the next annual case review, that would come up. 50-day timeline would be around if we're looking at new or additional areas of eligibility. So that would be a new piece. And then another 50-day timelines if we're considering anything additional service-wise or something like if we're going to add occupational therapy, technically there needs to be an evaluation for that before it can be added. So that's how that piece can work for us. And there's a nice little space for you to document that. And we have the option, if everyone agrees that there's no need for, we have enough data to properly program for this student to develop their IEP, then there's no need for a reevaluation. We want to make sure we document that we talked about that and we have that agreement going forward. So now, having said that, later on, if a parent or school personnel request this, that can always happen outside of the case conference. So if a parent says tomorrow, hey, yesterday I know I said it this way, but then the next couple of days, I really think that John needs to be reevaluated, and here's why. And then you have to respond to that request using your normal timeline, 10-day timeline, I suppose. So that's just something to keep in mind. Continuation of meeting is a circumstance that, if for whatever reason, we're not really supposed to put timelines on our meetings, like, hey, this meeting is going to only last 40 minutes or anything like that. However, if we have, for some reason, some of our core personnel that must be at that meeting have to leave at a certain time for whatever reason, instead of moving on without them, which is something we shouldn't be doing, we can talk to parents about continuation of the meeting. So there's space in there to say, hey, here's a meeting today, due to these events, possibly outside of our control, we're going to continue this meeting at a later date and finish up. The attendance piece is just marking who is in the room at the meeting. I guess the thing to say here is at this point that, parents can bring anybody they have see fit to bring to the meeting, and this is where you document who that happened to be. We check off who was there, and that becomes part of your record on your IEP. And then we're going to create the final IEP and move forward. So when we're creating that final IEP, you have a little bit of time. If you need to button some things up after the meeting, I would always advise, if you can, to hand off a final IEP to parents at the end of the meeting. I think I wouldn't say the right timeline here, but I think you only have a few days after the case conference to supply parents with the final IEP. It might be that I want to make sure I get this timeline. I think it's 5 business days actually after the meeting dates to supply that with parents. So that's something to keep in mind. So they have that final record, and then once the parent has received the IEP, they have a decision. If it's an initial, they have a decision to make whether or not they want to accept or reject that IEP. If they accept it, then we implement the IEP as written. If they reject it, then if it's an initial, that process is resolved. There's no more that we have to do as far as a special ed standpoint. If the student's already eligible, then once they've received that final IEP is when those 10 instructional day timelines start. So the 10 instructional day timelines start when the parent receives the final IEP, and then they have 10 instructional days to respond to the IEP, thereby they have their options for through their notice of procedural safeguards of due process, mediation, or a meeting. And they need to make that request within that time frame. Because if they don't respond at all in that time frame, then on the 11th instructional day after they've received that document, the IEP goes into effect. They also have, go ahead, Gail.
Well, I was just going to say, like, for that initial one, they have to sign it.
Mm-hmm.
But after that initial one, in Indiana, you don't have to sign it. And I would just suggest that especially parents that are newer to the process, remind them that just because they don't return something signed they need to, that's not going to determine when it starts. That if they don't sign it on day 11, it's going to go into effect unless they have said something. So
Right. And I
some,
think,
because parents think if they don't sign, it's not going to happen, but that's only on the first initial.
yeah, and that needs to be made, I mean, that's in the procedural safeguards, but that's one of those things we kind of talked about. Making sure the parents are aware of the relative or relevant information there. So if they don't sign it, it's still going to go into effect if the student's already eligible.
Right.
And if they choose to sign the IEP, all that means is we're waiving those 10 days and we're starting now. So that's the signature piece. And I sometimes run into this, and I don't know if Alana, Gail, if you run into this issue, but I still run into situations where folks will insist everybody signs the IEP. You know, just know the only signature that matters is that parent or guardian. So if everybody else signs the IEP, it really doesn't do anything. The only signature that really has an impact is that parent signature then for that initial to implement or subsequent IEPs to waive those 10 instructional days. So
yeah, and those hard ones are the ones that you do near close to a holiday, if those spring breaks and Christmas breaks, because your business days slash instructional days are,
so
those are
just to
business
rehash
days.
that, it's
right.
the only, I think it might be the only time in the rule that mentions business days that way.
Yeah.
But if you've held your meeting today and finished it, then 5 business days later. So what Gail mentions is important. If you have spring break, those are still business days. Everything but a weekend or national holiday is a business day typically. So think bank days. So if the bank is open, business day. So if you have your conference right before summer, we're not going to be in school for 2.5 months or less now. So the business days still count, but those instructional days don't happen over the summer. So that's I don't know. Those are the things that I stay up nights thinking about. So right. So wow, look at that. We're at the end once again. So just know we have our evaluations for today. You can check that out with that link right there. We also have a link to our websites and our contact information also. I wanted to make sure, I know this is something we all talked about earlier. This is the last of our series. I'm gonna go ahead and see if we can stop the recording here. I think we got it.